Welcome back to the lecture and the last hands-on segment where we're going to work with the Code Pipeline service. Now, the Code Pipeline service provides us with a way to integrate some of the other services together, such as GitHub and Code Commit, Code Build, and Code Deploy. We can integrate all of these services together into one single pipeline where code is taken from our version control repository. It is then uploaded into a code build environment where a build artifact is created, and then that build artifact is placed in an S3 bucket where it is then picked up by the code deploy service and ultimately deployed to our EC2 instances. For this project, we need to do some preliminary setup tasks. And the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a GitHub personal access token. Now, strictly speaking, this token isn't actually needed for this particular project, simply because the repository that we'll be working with is a public repository. However, in your assignment, you'll be working with a private repository. And in order for the Code Pipeline service to pull the source code from your repository, it will need some sort of access credential. And that access credential is provided by the personal access token. Essentially, this is a token that you can use instead of a username and password to access your GitHub account. And so the way you do that is you go into your GitHub account and access your personal settings in the account. Then you click on the developer settings link. And in the developer settings link, you can access the personal access tokens link. There you will generate a new token. And I'll give the token a name. I'll just call it the website pipeline token. And I want to give this token the full repo access privilege, and I'm going to give it the admin repo hook privilege as well. So those two privileges, that's all I need to do. And then I will say generate token. And when I click on generate token, it's going to generate this random alphanumeric string, and this is the actual token that I will use. So I can use this token instead of providing a username and password. And I'm going to keep this tab open for now because I'm going to reference this token in a later part of the process. The other thing that I want to do is I want to clone a repository, a Python project repository. So I'll copy that from the lecture notes and I'll paste that in to go to this GitHub repository, and I want to clone this into not clone it. We want to fork it into our personal account. So we're going to fork this repository, and I'm going to fork it to my personal account. It is now being forked, and this happens pretty quickly. Okay, the repository has now been forked into my account. So essentially I have a copy of that repository. Okay, I'm going to go back then to the notes, and we're going to launch a CloudFormation template. And the template is going to automatically create a code pipeline for us. So along with a number of other resources, the template is going to create a VPC which contains 2 public subnets. The template's going to launch 2 EC2 instances as part of an auto-scaling group, 1 instance in each subnet. And then it'll create an application load balancer to distribute requests to the web servers in that auto-scaling group. Very, very similar, almost identical to the environment that we created in the previous hands-on segment earlier in the lecture. In this case, it's also creating a code pipeline. And what that code pipeline will do is, once the environment has been set up, it will automatically go out to GitHub, retrieve the code in this Python repository that we just forked. It will take that code and give it to the code build service. The code build service will build that repository using the buildspec.yaml file in the source code repository. It will produce, the code build service will produce an output artifact, and it will store that output artifact in an S3 artifact bucket. The code deploy service then will take that output artifact and automatically deploy it to the web server instances that were created in the environment. So as you can see, there's a lot of stuff going on, and this whole process of downloading the source code, building it, and then deploying the code into the environment, all of that is being orchestrated by the code pipeline service. Let's go ahead then and launch the template. I'm going to copy this template, and in the CloudFormation dashboard, I'm going to create a new stack. I'm going to specify the template and click on Next. When I do that, I have to give it a name. So I'm going to just call this one Website Pipeline. And then there are a number of parameters. The first one is my GitHub access token. And I'm going to copy and paste that token from the token from the GitHub settings. And the GitHub branch is the master branch. I want to pull the master branch from the Python project repository. I need to provide my GitHub username. This is how it can find that repository. I will specify a key name that I'm going to use for the EC2 instances. My IP address is, I'm just going to copy it from here. I did the check my IP address and provide that as Cedar notation. The auto scaling group size is 2. I'm creating 2 web servers. I also need to provide the project URL, the Git URL. And I can just simply copy the URL from my forked repository, and I need to add the .git extension to it. That's the actual project URL. The web AMI and the web type I don't need to change. I click on Next, and then I don't need to make any changes to options. Click Next again. It allows me to review. It tells me it might acknowledge, I have to acknowledge it might create IAM resources. That's great. I'm going to create the stack. And we're off and running. The stack is now launching, and CloudFormation will create all of the different resources for us. And so while it's got to create all of the AWS resources, and then it will automatically trigger that pipeline. Anytime we launch the stack for the first time like this, it'll trigger that pipeline. And the pipeline will take 15, 20 minutes to run. So while it's doing that, let's jump over to the CloudFormation template that we just launched. And I've opened this CloudFormation template code in an editor. And we'll just quickly kind of walk through it. We've got a set of parameters. Here are all the different parameters that I provided when I launched the template, things like the project URL and the GitHub username and access token and so on. And then there are resources which are created. Again, most of these resources are identical to the resources that were created in the previous hands-on segment. We have the S3 artifact bucket, and we have a bucket policy, which is requiring encryption. We are creating a VPC, and there are 2 public subnets here which are being created. We have a couple security groups, one for the application load balancer, one for the web servers, an internet gateway that's being attached to the VPC. We have a public routing table and some routes that are set up, routes out to the internet through the internet gateway. Application load balancer, which is associated with both subnets. The listener, which is forwarding to a target group, and the target group has a health check, which is /health. And we have an auto scaling group, which is also associated with the launch configuration for the load balancer. And of course we have the instance profile. We have that web instance rule, same as the previous hands-on segment. Here's our launch configuration where we have parameterized a number of the different properties for the auto-scaling group, like the key name, instance type, image ID, etc. We have our user data script. Again, this is installing the code deploy agent onto the EC2 instance. Here's our web instance role. This web instance role has to have the code deploy full access privilege. That's because the agent, the code deploy agent, which is running on the EC2 instance, needs to be able to communicate with the code deploy service. It also needs to be able to retrieve output artifacts from the S3 artifact bucket. We have a code deploy project set up. And one of the interesting things to note is that the code build and code deploy services are modified a little bit in this template versus previous templates where you've seen these resources. And for example, with the code build project resource, for the artifacts, we have a type of code pipeline, whereas in previous examples, the artifacts were coming from an S3 bucket. In this case, the artifact is coming from Codepipeline. Essentially, the Codepipeline service is orchestrating, is sort of managing the artifacts, and is handing off these artifacts to services like the code build service. But most everything else is sort of the same. The code build has an environment, and we're specifying what that environment is. We also have so here's the source. Here's the source code. The source is being provided by Codepipeline as well. So Codepipeline is not only providing the source location for the project, it's also providing the destination artifact location as well. We have an app build role. This is the code build role, which is allowing the code build service to access the S3 artifact bucket. We also have the build log policy. That's the same as we saw in previous examples. And here's the code deploy resources. Very similar to previous examples. We have the code deploy application, our compute platform as a server, because we're deploying to EC2. And we have our deployment group, It's pointing at our application. It's referencing the application. It's referencing the auto scaling group. We're using traffic control, one at a time deployments, and we are specifying the load balancer target group that's going to be managed by the code deployment group. There's a code deploy service role, which is being used, and that service role is accessing the AWS code deploy role. That's the service that it needs to use to do deployments. And then finally, we have something new. In this template, we have a code pipeline resource, and it's conveniently called the pipeline resource. The code pipeline is defining all of the different steps that are required, all the different stages of the code delivery pipeline. And we start out by defining an artifact store. The artifact store is going to be an S3 bucket, and it's the S3 artifact bucket that we created in the early stages of the template. The code pipeline has a role, and it assumes the code pipeline service role, and we'll see that defined here shortly. And then here's really the key part of the pipeline resource configuration. It's the stages property. And this is where we define each stage of the pipeline. The first, and these are in order. The first stage is the source stage. We've given it the name source. And the source stage has a set of actions that are defined here. And how do you know what actions to define for this source stage? Well, these are the things that you would pull from the documentation. The first thing it's going to do is it's going to get the source. And so there's a task called, or an action called get source. We have an action type. It's the category is it's pulling source. It's getting it from a third party, and the third party provider is GitHub. And then we need to provide some configuration information to allow the code pipeline service to access our GitHub repository. So we had to provide it with the owner name for and then the repository name, the branch that we want to pull. We had to provide it with some sort of access token and authorization token, and that's where we provided that GitHub access token that we created earlier in the hands-on project. And then the output artifacts, we define an output artifact, and we've named that the source code artifact. In the second stage, then, we have a build stage. And the first action in the build stage is we want to build the source. And to do that, it's going to use an input artifact. And the input artifact is the one that we call source code. And this artifact name matches the output artifact from the source stage. The action type for this action is a build action, and we're going to use the code build provider. We're using the AWS code build service, essentially. And for the configuration, we need to specify the project name. And the project name is, we're referencing that logical name that we assigned to the code build resource earlier in the template. The output artifact from that project then is going to be an artifact that we're calling the code artifact. And then the third stage is the deploy stage, and it has an action that is called the deploy artifact action. And for the input artifact, it's going to use the artifact that we call the code artifact. Again, we're just sort of connecting these stages together. The output from this one stage, from the build stage, is an input into the deploy stage. So we use the same artifact name. The action type ID, the category is a deployment. We're going to use the AWS Codeploy service to do that. And for the configuration for this service, we are referencing the application name that we created, and we are also referencing the deployment group name, which is another resource that we created in the template. So we end up with a pipeline resource that has 3 different stages: a source stage, a build stage, and a deploy stage. And again, the configuration, the properties that you see defined here for all these actions, these are things that you would find in the AWS Codepipeline documentation. The Codepipeline service, the resource that we create, needs to have a role associated with it. And so here's the role that is set up. The key thing about this role is that it needs to be able to access the artifact bucket. It needs to be able to not only get resources from that bucket, but also put resources in that bucket, because it's essentially handing off output artifacts from one service and using them as input artifacts to another service. It also needs to be able to orchestrate the code deploy service. So it needs to be able to do things like create deployments and get applications and so on. It needs to be able to manage EC2 resources. It needs to be able to manage EC2 instances, elastic load balancers, auto scaling groups, and it needs to be able to write metrics to CloudWatch and CloudWatch logs. And finally, it needs to be able to manage some of the actions in the code build service as well. It needs to be able to start builds and get build information. So you can see that the code pipeline resource needs to have access to all of, many of the other resources that are being created within this template. And there are a couple different outputs. We have an ELB endpoint and we have an S3 bucket that are being output, our S3 artifact bucket. Now let's go back to the template and see where we are at. So if I do a refresh, it tells us that the creation of our stack is complete. But just because the stack is complete doesn't actually mean that it's finished deploying everything. If I look at outputs, it's going to give us an ELB endpoint. But before I look at that, why don't I go to let's go to the code pipeline service and see what is going on. The template created a code pipeline for us. So you can see it's still in progress. So the resources, the AWS resources themselves create pretty quickly, but now there's a pipeline which has been executed. If I click on the pipeline, I can see that our source code is flowing through our pipeline and it's currently in the deploy stage. So looking at the very top, you can see that there's a source stage. Each one of these are stages in the pipeline. A source stage where it retrieved source from GitHub. And then there was a build stage where it built the code. If I click on the details link here, it'll actually take me to the build project. So here's the log, the output log from that project. You can see all the build code. That created an output artifact, and it is now deploying that output artifact using code deploy. If I click on details in that stage, it will take me to the code deploy service. And you saw this in the previous segment where it is deploying our code. Now it's already deployed the code to one of the two web servers. So if I go back to CloudFormation, and if I look at the CloudFormation template, this website pipeline template, if I look at outputs, and I go to the ELB endpoint, and I pull up that endpoint address, I am then directed to one of the web servers that's up and running with this very simple website that has now been deployed to the web server. I'll go back to the code pipeline service and again take a look at the pipeline that's in progress. I'm going to click on details under deploy to see the deployment, and I'm going to view events on the second instance to see kind of where it's at. And it's still in the initial stages where it's blocking the traffic. The load balancer is essentially shedding load. It's blocking traffic from that second instance. Okay, so now it's actually deploying the application. This is good timing. I didn't expect it to be doing this, but this is great. So it's installed the application. Now it is going to start up. It's going to do kind of essentially restart the web service. It's going to start up the application. It'll do some validation. And then it will turn on the load balancer distribution to this new instance. You can see how the code pipeline service is really helpful. It essentially glues all of these other services together. The GitHub service that's storing our source code, the code build service, which is pulling the source code from GitHub and performing a build. The output artifact from that build is then sent to the code deploy service, where it is then deployed automatically to EC2 instances. So this deployment looks like it has completed. If I go back to my code pipeline, then all of my code pipeline stages are successful and my application has been successfully deployed. If I hit refresh, then it's you can't really see it here, but trust me, it's the application load balancer is distributing the request to both of the web applications running on the web servers. Now, what would happen if I updated the GitHub repository right now? What would happen if I updated my code? Well, the way that this pipeline is currently configured, essentially nothing would happen. But as you will see in your future projects and work that you'll be doing in this class, there's a way to configure the pipeline so that it is automatically triggered anytime you make a code change to the repository. And this is a very common practice. Basically this is one of the key fundamental parts of a continuous integration practice. Every single time we make a change to our code and we merge it into something like a master branch, we want that to automatically trigger a new build of our project. And oftentimes we will deploy that new build, deploy the output artifact into some sort of test environment. So just like this, where we deployed our output artifact to a set of web servers, we could now then trigger something like an automated test suite that would go out and perform a series of automated tests on our application platform to see if it works as expected. I hope that this hands-on demonstration was helpful for you in understanding how all these different pieces of code tools, of CodeStar tools, can fit together, and how you can use Codepipeline to glue these different services and form a single software delivery pipeline. Now, in terms of deleting all of these different resources, one thing to keep in mind is that you can't delete the CloudFormation template until you empty that S3 bucket. If CloudFormation cannot delete an S3 bucket that has objects in it. So just remember that before you delete this stack and all of these resources, that you go into the artifact S3 bucket and empty the bucket so that it is completely empty. Then you can go into CloudFormation and delete the stack. That will remove all of the different resources that were created in this project.